Well, hello there, Scott Spann here, speaking to you from my sailboat office here in Sausalito, California. I really want to thank you for joining me here, and I'm asking myself that same question, and that is, at the end of this conversation, what I want to be different. And what I want you to understand is how one of these projects actually unfolds over time. What does it look like end to end? And it's going to be a little bit longer video because I'm going to talk you through all of the pieces, so forgive me for that, but I think you'll find it's well worth your while. So let me do just a bit of a background here. You'll recall that from my earlier videos, I talked about some of my typical engagements, with Apple, with HP's Global Notebook Supply Chain, the White House on their Trusted Identities in Cyberspace project. I'm not going to read all of these, but this methodology has been well tested. It's been in the business world, in the social world, in the government world, in everywhere from Texas to California to Guatemala, across a whole host of different kinds of cultures and around a whole host of issues. And there's more of that on my other blogs if you go take a look at those. We also talked about it because I want you to have this background because it's an important piece of understanding why this particular methodology is essential. We talked about the kinds of problems that are emerging at an increasing rate, these complex multi-stakeholder problems. We talked about in an earlier video, the one on why am I doing this, that traditional ability to solve them looks at best like this, some say like that, it makes things worse, and the gap that's got to be filled. And I think we've come up with something here that helps us actually close that gap there. So that's why I want to give you this how piece. We also in an earlier video, the blog called about, where we talked about a complexity mindset, and we talked about how the world is moving from increasing certainty from certainty, relative certainty, to increasing degrees of uncertainty, and how when that happens, we have to transition from hierarchy, whether it's a simple or complicated problem, into more of a self-organizing network, and how the solutions on the certainty side were more best practice and good practice. On the complex adaptive side, they're more emergent, and there's more on that in that other video if you want to go look there. So this is focused more on how do we create these self-organizing networks, and how do you build one from scratch, from the ground up, not in a hierarchical way. On the third blog I did, we talked about how most people think this is impossible. They don't even know that you can do this. And the intent of these blogs is to demonstrate that you not only can you do it, I've been doing it for about 15 years now, something like that. As I said, in a whole host of different challenges. And so you can go to that video and see what this map was about and how we confronted someone else's challenge that they literally said was impossible. We said, that's fine if you believe that, we'll do the work for free, pay us only if we succeed. And a month later, we got paid. So there's a story on that too if you want to see that. But now I want to jump into the how of emergent impact and the how of effortless leadership. And if this is the first one of these you're listening to, when I say that word effortless leadership, I'm not being idealistic, I'm not being altruistic, this isn't pie in the sky. We simply have to figure out how to do this in a way that where we don't struggle. We've all had the experience of effortlessness. I don't know if you've had it in a sport or in a musical performance or in a conversation, or even in some sort of an innovation project you were involved in. But if we know how to do these things well, they need to be effortless, especially if we're looking at the scale we're going to. They need to have that sense of not struggling. And I contend that we struggle because we go against our human nature in most of our business and social settings, not with our human nature. And I speak to that based on my background in trauma psychotherapy and developmental psychotherapy and group psychotherapy, in addition to my time with Arthur Anderson and my IT background and all the other stuff. So effortless leadership is a real thing to be striving for and something that we can achieve and we have to achieve. So how do we get into this? Well, there are 4 fundamental emergent questions, or questions that follow that emergent flow. And we have to be able to explore and align around these questions if we're going to move forward. And I'll use climate change as an example. So I'll just state them. The first one is what's the state of the reality, and then what's causing that reality, and then where do we intervene in that reality, and then how do we make the structural and then behavioral changes. And I'll say why I say it that way in just a minute. But if we take climate change, that state of reality thing, we were arguing for the longest time. It's getting hotter, no, it's getting colder, it's permanent, no, it's temporary. And it took a while to settle in on that question, at least for a critical mass of people to settle in on that question. Once we did, then we were able to go to the next question, because if we couldn't agree that the state of reality was what it was, that we were experiencing climate change, we'd never get to what's causing that. But once we got clear, a critical mass got clear, then we could say, well, now what's causing that? And even there was arguments. Well, the sun's getting hotter. No, it's cyclical. Well, it could be fossil fuels and humanity that's doing it. We finally got a critical mass to get clear about the human impact on fossil fuels is having a lot to do with this. So once we got clear on that, then we got into the question about, well, what do we intervene in that reality? And we're talking about that. We're talking about building, more renewable energy. We're talking about energy efficiency. We're talking about moving away from fossil fuels. And as we get clearer and clearer about that, then we'll be positioned, and we're not there yet, to talk about, well, how do we make the structural and then behavioral changes? And I say structural because shifting out of fossil and into renewables and is a significant shift for us economically, socially, politically, even militarily. It's a big structural shift. We need to make the structural shift before we make the behavioral shift, because when we set up structures, take for example our transportation systems or our tax systems, if we make those structures move in the direction we want the society to go or our actors in the system to go, they can swim downstream with that. But if we don't have those structures in place and we're asking people to make changes, they're basically having to swim upstream, and they can't sustain that. They're going to get tired and fall away. So we've got to be able to make the structural and then the behavioral changes. So those are the 4 fundamental questions. But how do we get at those questions? Well, there's an emergent approach to this. And I say emergent because it arises out of the system itself. So we need to be able to build leadership, and I'm using these words for a specific reason, relationship and clarity at these 3 levels: the individual, the subgroup, and the whole group. And I'm going to give you examples of that in just a minute. But we're building from the ground up here. It really is an emergent process. And when I say leadership, I don't mean just a CEO or just an executive director or just a mayor or a governor. I mean the ability to lead. And that resides at all sorts of levels in organizations and in communities and elsewhere. When I say relationship and clarity, I'm saying that specifically because typically we have to first get in relationship with one another and relationship with reality before we can get clear with one another and get clear about reality. And we're doing that at those 3 levels, moving from the individual to the subgroup to the whole. And that enables us to act at the level of the ecosystem. So let me grab a little deeper on this. Here I've taken that and broken it out in a little more granularity. So you'll see here that I've got, creating relationship and clarity in the center. And on the left-hand side, when I was teaching a class on this in Atlanta some years ago, I wrote down those levels, those organic levels: self with another, team, an organization, the constituents of our marketplace, and the ecosystem. What I realized then was when we get into relationship with ourselves and when we get clear as an individual, that for the first time we're actually able to lead, because typically people won't follow someone who's not in relationship with themselves and not clear within themselves. They're not able to lead. People won't follow them. I say typically. There have been some exceptions, and recently in fact, but generally that's how it goes. When we get into relationship and clarity with another, that's when we can build trust. It's much easier to build trust at an individual one-on-one level than it is in a large group. At the team level, that's where innovation arises, and we put together teams in order to innovate. We put together task forces, we put together cross-functional teams, we put together crews and things like that to help us figure out how do we innovate on something. At the level of the organization, that's where execution comes in. And I also added network here. But execution steps in because we form organizations to do things as a collective body that we can't do as individuals or teams. At the level of the constituents or the marketplace, that's where scalability kicks in, because we have to learn how to scale in order to serve more and more people. And then at the level of the ecosystem, that's where we begin to have to think about and formulate for sustainability, because it's got to be able to survive in an ecosystem that's evolving over time. So that's the general structure of effortless leadership. So to review this, at the individual level, we do individual interviews and individual systems maps. Those are systems maps, just not just any maps, to make sure we really understand people. And I'll show you an example of that in just a minute. We're gathering those to get a sense of the ecosystem. We're doing like a 360-degree snapshot. So we're interviewing between 20 and 40 people to get those perspectives we need. And so we do those maps. Once we've done those maps, we pull people together to get into relationship with one another at the subgroup level. And you can call those affinity groups. You can think of them as, we do behavior over time graphs in there, and we review the integrated map. Once we take those 20 to 30 individual maps, we cluster them together in an integrated map to understand the ecosystem as a whole, so that we can all understand the ecosystem as a whole. And I'll show you one of those in a minute. And then at the whole group, organization or network level, we do a leverage analysis of that integrated map once it's been validated by the team. And then we do step into a 2-day strategic intensive, and I'll speak briefly about that at the end. And then at the market and ecosystem level, that's when we move into 90-day projects, and I'll tell you a bit about why we do 90-day projects in a minute versus 1-year or 3-year plans. I'll talk to that when I get there. So let me walk you through an example here. Some of you may have seen the REAMP example. I've done videos on that in the past, but I'm going to give you a fresh example here. This is one that I did recently with the Vermont Farm to School Network. And if you go on their website, if you Google them, you'll find this section, you'll find these slides and these boxes. And this is us, together in our strategy session there in Vermont on the Shelburne Farms properties. We did 20 plus individual maps and interviews and maps. And I'm not going to belabor this, but I am going to say that we interviewed for the farm to school system, we interviewed folks in government, including the Department of Defense, because they run the procurement system. We interviewed farmers. We interviewed people in the food preparation and distribution. We interviewed the people that actually prepare the foods in the schools, interviewed teachers and students, basically a 360-degree snapshot, and we're asking all of them the same thing. We're saying, what are you trying to cause, for whom or what or where? And as they tell us that story, I'm making notes and I'm recapping in my mind what they're telling me. And at the end, once I hang up, I go off and I produce a map. And in this case, this map here was the goal for this individual is we're trying to create the initial conditions to move from 44% to 60% of local food by the end of school year 2015-16. That was their goal. And that next layer, I'm not going to read all that, but those were the 5 key drivers required that directly caused that goal to happen. And the rest of that stuff under there were all the other bits that they told us in the stories they told that drive those key drivers to produce that outcome. And so we share these maps back with individuals. It has a lot of benefits. It adds value to the way they think. They see that this is not a business as usual kind of a project. And it typically inspires them to want to participate in the next steps of the process, something we haven't necessarily asked them to do at the beginning. We just, can we interview you? But we have to prove our value by mapping them, understanding them, and reflecting back to them, and adding value to how they think. So once we've done all those maps, we're able to sit back and reflect and go, oh, you know, although we have these 20 plus different maps, they're actually have sort of 4 fundamental things they're attracted to. They're either attracted to being a grower and a processor, and they kind of fit together, or they're attracted because they work through the government to achieve these ends, or they're in the school system and that's what attracts them. They like working through the schools, or they're interested in community development. And so we invite them to attend those 4 different subgroups because we want groups that already have some kind of an affinity, some kind of a connection with each other before we put together any individuals that don't have that kind of connection. So we put them into these affinity groups, these subgroups. And once that happens, we bring them together and we ask each of them in this subgroup, there might be, 10 to 15 people in a subgroup. And we ask them, what are you trying to, what's your goal here? Why, in this case, it was the schools. What are you trying to accomplish in the school? And in this domain of the farm to school system. And so they each individually come up with a goal. They share those goals. We cluster them out into sort of like pods. And then we say, okay, repeat your goal with one another and then come up with a goal for your pod. And then we bring all the pods back together. And then we say, okay, let's hear what each pod came up with. And now out of that, can we ferret out what the goal for the whole room could be? And in this case, they said establishing the true value of a healthy, socially just and sustainable food system and its contributors, catalyzing a cultural change. Now that's what the school systems really want to do through the farm to school system. So we put that goal on the left-hand side. And then at the top, we say, okay, well then, what does it look like when it's at a 10, when you're rocking with this thing? And they say, well, we have empowered and engaged children. They understand that they can make a difference in society and that through their actions inside the school system and outside the school system in the food system. And then we ask them, well then, if it's failing, if this goal isn't happening at all, what does that look like at the bottom, a 0 or a 1? And they say, well, our kids are malnourished and they're fearful because they feel like they're being controlled. They don't have any say in what's going on and bad things are happening to them. So those are the 2 endpoints that they came up with. And then we chart, so how are we going to manage this over time? How are we going to think about this over time? And so people said, well, we need to go back to about 1920 to think about what's happened to that goal over time. And so we said, okay, we'll go back to 1920 and then we'll look out to about 2100, then we'll kind of balance that thing out. And so they picked a rate of change for that goal, like it was moving up or down or staying flat, and they had a lot more exchanges of information than I've typified here, than I've represented here. But what's happening now is all the people in this room full of about 15 people are swapping all kinds of information. Some of the people are in their, in their 60s and 70s, or even, 70s is about the top end of it. And they're sharing what it was like back when. Some of them understand the history of it, but they're basically swapping all kinds of information that they wouldn't have shared if we'd said, read these articles, watch these videos, read these books. The whole room is getting smarter. And they're plotting this out over time. And then they get to today. And then we say, well, what's likely to happen to this going forward, given this is a system? And inevitably, I wouldn't be in the room if it wasn't going to get worse going forward. They would already have solved it. So there's the getting worse. Then this green line you see, the dotted green line you see, is how Vermont is likely going to do going forward. And so Vermont feels like they've got kind of a handle on it, but it's still fairly flat and it's not anywhere near a 10. And then we say, okay, given that Vermont's a leader in the farm to school movement nationally, which they indeed are, the USDA has modeled many of their programs after what Vermont has done. How does this system have to perform, this goal have to perform in order for you to be as successful as you want to be? And there you see a pretty steep line that by 2025, they've got to get into a significantly different position on that goal. And that gap there that you see between that black line going down and that solid green line going up is where I come up with, in almost every case, what I'm calling that 3x shift in an ability to perform, because we then design to close that gap. So what happens next? Okay, so we've gone through this process. They swapped all this information. They've come into a better relationship with one another and with reality. And at the beginning of this process, I've done this. I wanted to create a benchmark. So I've said, how do you need to be in order to solve for the kind of thing you want to solve for, the reason you're in the room? And I ask this way up at front before we do the behavioral time graph. And we get these different responses. These are just sort of representative responses. People will say, oh, a little impatient, open-minded, focused, respectful. Some get way out on a limb and say, well, maybe we need to be a little disrespectful. And you see these other things there. But they're pretty politically correct kind of responses. They don't have a lot of energy in their voices. They're just sort of saying what they think they need to say. Once this is done, then I ask them, how do you think we need to be in order to solve for this? And you get a completely different order of magnitude. There's a lot more emotional energy in the room. There's a lot more aliveness in the room. And people are saying things like I've highlighted in green here, like courageous, excited and scared, kick ass. Someone was particularly excited about it. Non-compromising, revolution, unwavering. They're saying those kind of things. And now these are important words that I pull up here because we want to create an anchor state for them as we go forward. I want them to remember that this is the state of being they were in once they saw the situation, when they were in relationship with each other and with reality. Out of this, then we come up with a shared goal. They've abbreviated this to, I think, what they call 75, 50 by 25. And it's they use that as kind of the little abbreviated version of it. But basically is that by 2025, 75% of the schools will lead the cultural shift to a values-based food system, engaging 75% of the students who purchase at least 50% of their food from a socially just, environmentally and financially sustainable regional food system. So that star at the top of that is remind me to say that's the future state of reality they're going for. So when we say at that back then, state of reality, the structure, where to intervene, and then making the structural behavioral changes, that state of reality has two endpoints to it. One is the current one, and the other is the future one. And we want to get clear about that state of reality and get aligned about that so we can move toward that collectively. I then took those 20 plus different individual perspectives, individual maps I did, and spread them out all over the table and said, okay, all of these things have to fit together in physical reality. How might they fit together? And I put together this integrated map. And then in the subgroup meetings, we walk everybody through this from that place of that high energy, that goal they picked, what's going to happen to that goal, what needs to happen to that goal, and let them just go at the map. Just beat that thing to death. And we work this map until it answers three fundamental questions. Does this describe your reality, all of its parts, all of its pieces, the relationships between those parts and pieces, and the dynamic of that relationship? Yes, when this goes up, that goes up, but this goes down. And how does all that fit together? The second thing is, does it explain why your reality is performing the way it's performing? Can you tell why it's doing what it's doing? And can you see how it will do what you want it to do? Does it explain that? And then the third thing is, do you see yourself in here? Because if they don't see themselves in here, they're not going to play long term. They're not going to, there's no, why bother, right? I'm not in this. It doesn't involve me. So those are the three questions we ask, and we work the map until we're sure we've answered all of that very, very solidly. Then we go through a series of rigorous analyses. And so when I say rigorous, I mean we apply a piece of software to it. It's called a cross-impact matrix analysis, or some know it as a MICMAC, the French word for it. That's a piece of software developed by the intelligence services in the 60s to help identify nodes of high opportunity in networks of great uncertainty. And they still use it. That's still one of their primary software tools. They've refined it through to today. So it's a really solid, well-tested piece of software. We look at systems archetypes. We look at how the different resources are trending in the system. We look at levels of intervention in the system based on whether it's an information system or a goal or a rule or a mindset. We do a whole host of them. I won't go them all right now. But out of that, we come out with this set of, okay, no matter how we look at this system, from the top, the bottom, left, right, through the middle, these 4 or 5 or 7 variables show up consistently. And out of that, we make a selection of what do we believe the leverage points are. And then we sequence them. So you'll see we've got a 1, 2, 3, 4. These things, I found in most systems that a lot of people have the right answer. It's just not time for that part of the answer. Another part of the answer has to happen first. And so people will argue, and often they're all right. It's just a matter of getting it sequenced. And then we'll identify then within that sequence who's attracted to which one of these levers. So let me talk now about how this unfolds. And so we've done the 20 plus individual maps. We had something like 60 subgroup participants. We had 35 people show up in these 90-day team projects. And these 90-day team projects, if you saw that complexity video in that upper left-hand corner where it says how you respond to such a system, you'll see that you probe first, because in a complex adaptive system, it's changing. It's so dynamic. There's so much uncertainty. We really don't know what's going on there. So the first thing you do is you probe into that system. And so a 90-day project is a low amplitude but high frequency move inside of a complex adaptive system, which is much more how nature operates, how the human body operates. It's not a high amplitude, low frequency, like a 5-year plan that we do every 3 years or every 5 years or something like that, or even a 1-year plan that we just check in on the plan once a year. A complex adaptive world is moving much too fast for that. So we launch into these 90-day probes. Now, this group launched into 90-day projects. They're so great to do as the first step out of the box after a strategy session, for this reason, that they require very little commitment and very little investment. Very little investment of an individual's time. Okay, I'll try this for 90 days and see how it goes. Very little in terms of a foundation's investment. The foundation funding for these were like $1,500 per team to just get their 90-day project up and running. At the end of that time, however, they were so successful that when they applied for funding at a higher level across all 4 of their projects, and they got all of their funding. In fact, the Vermont Community Foundation said this is the most comprehensive and cohesive set of projects that we've ever received, and we're funding them all. And we're funding Betsy Rosenbluth, the woman who was guiding this network, this loosely affiliated network, funded her for 18 months. So they did that as a next round, and then what came back was that the foundation said, it's been reported to me that they said you're the most successful project in our portfolio. We're going to give you a $250,000 unsolicited grant. Just tell us what you're going to do with it, and it's yours. So we went through that process, and then the state came to them and is offering $400,000. I'm not sure how that process is going or where they are in that process, but that's how this thing has picked up steam and grown from just a few individual interviews out to this end of it. So I think that's about enough. I have talked your ear off here. I apologize for taking so long, but as you can see, I had a lot to say. I hope you found it valuable to say it, to hear it, that is. If you got any more questions, if you're watching this anywhere besides scottspann.com, go on over there, leave me a comment, give me a like. Don't like me, but tell you what you don't like about it. Let me know what kind of complex problem you're working on, what you'd like to see me explore in this conversation with you. In the meantime, I sincerely hope this finds you thriving, and thanks so much for listening. Take good care.